Well, hello, everybody. This is Rebecca Monte-Kugel speaking. I'm going to read the UCR Land Acknowledgement. Sorry, I don't have a photo or a picture up. I'm not good with Zoom yet, and I don't know how to make that work. But let me proceed. We at UCR would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseno, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. Thank you. And without further ado, I believe I get to introduce the Chancellor. So Chancellor Kim Wilcox.
Thank you. I am, in fact, Kim Wilcox. I'm the Chancellor at UC Riverside. It's great to welcome everyone here to today's version of the Chancellor's Distinguished Lecture with Dr. Hartig. I went to a small junior high school, and we had a class of 30 students who moved from instructor to instructor. We had one social studies teacher, Neil Anderson, who taught social science at first hour of the morning and American history the last hour of the day. And I remember one day in 8th grade, we were going to have a test in social science at 8 o'clock in the morning. And as junior high students are, we wanted to argue for a change in that schedule. Junior high students put it off as late as we could until the last hour of the day. And our logic was the things that were social science in the morning would only be history in the afternoon. So it made perfect sense for us to move the quiz from first hour of the morning to the last hour of the day. Now, I give Mr. Anderson great credit for creating an understanding among his students of the nature of history and the time flow and how the things that we do today become history tomorrow or later in the day if you're trying to argue for a change in the quiz. And it's a sense of what Dr. Hartig, I think, will talk about today, the notion of public history. We all appreciate that we're part of history in that the events that we participate in pass in time and then are recorded or not, or remembered or not by others who follow us. But the notion of public history is something even deeper, that not just do we live the history, we have a responsible for managing that story, saving it, preserving it, embellishing it where it needs to be embellished, and refining it where it needs to be refined. A huge rethinking of how many of us across society think about our roles in both participants and preservers of history. We're fortunate at Riverside to have such a great cohort of historians, but also public historians, for whom this sense of the treatment of our own past is important to their study. And we're immensely proud of Dr. Hartig, who in fact is a product of that great Riverside tradition. And now it's my great opportunity to pass the baton to Dr. Cliff Trafser, who is one of our preeminent public historians. Cliff?
Well, it's my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce Anthea Hartig. I'm speaking to you today from former Serrano and Tongva village at Yucaipa, the place where the water gathers. Anthea, as you know, is the first director of the American History Museum who is a woman. And she is extremely well trained here at Riverside. She received her MA in 1989. She received her PhD in 2001. She has held many positions locally and within the state. Most recently was the director and CEO of the California Historical Society. Some of my colleagues from the Historical Society they're joining us today. She has always had a commitment to diversity and inclusiveness. And ladies and gentlemen, you can see that in the new strategy plan, or the strategic plan for the National Museum of American History. The strategic plan reads this way, in part: the rights of all people without the threat of violence because of race, ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation shall be a part of the National Museum. The museum must be accessible to all people. The employees must reflect the American population, and it must be relevant to the 21st century. Her new exhibits also speak well of Anthea, because the first one that I want to take note of is In Slavery Shadow, George Floyd and American Legacies. We're creating icons, How to Remember Women's Suffrage. And the last one, Girlhood. It's complicated. Please join me in welcoming our friend, my friend, and a friend of UCR's, Anthea Hartig, who will speak to us today, Public History as Practice. Anthea?
Oh, thank you so much, Cliff, for that lovely introduction and for all that you mean to me and so many others in public history and in the tribal worlds. Many thanks to Chancellor Wilcox for your leadership and the invitation to address all of you today. Of course, I'm still aglow from my receiving the Distinguished Alumnus Award last month. I'm displaying proudly. It's humbling to join the very impressive list of they who participated in this lecture series before me, and I'm grateful. Adding to Monty's and to Cliff's acknowledgements, I too am honored to join you and acknowledge the precedents, the ancestors and the descendants of the Piscataway, the Paumoki, and the Natchatchang tribes as I join you from Washington, DC. So wherever you are at this moment, give thanks to the first peoples on whose land we're honored to live, love, struggle, and work. Also want to give thanks to those who have come before me and those with whom I ride along on history's journey, whose grace, generosity, and goodness I thrive on, and to whom I'm indebted, and many of you are on this call, so thank you. Let us also pause as we begin our time together and acknowledge this moment of intersecting crises, viral, racial, economic, political, I think I mentioned political, climate, and let us acknowledge seriously our individual and our collective grief, our loss, our fears, but also our hope and our resiliency and our devotion to service. Our thoughts go out to the families who've lost loved ones due to COVID-19, police brutality, or racist violence. I'd like to begin by sharing a brand new video that I shared with permission from the National Museum of American History and our partners and collaborators at the History Channel. I was going to keynote their first annual history conference, which they cutely named HistoryCon, in Pasadena this past spring, before the pandemic made such gatherings a public health hazard. So I'm grateful to my team, to the History Channel and to A&E. So they had asked me to pick a few of my favorite things from the National Collection that I am now honored to steward. So I'm excited to share it with you. I think it encapsulates in a way my learning path as an historian and the importance of preserving and sharing the materiality of our past as a useful tool to create a more just, informed, and compassionate future. So let's roll the video and then I'll be back on to share some more thoughts. I'm Anthea Hartig, the Elizabeth MacMillan Director of the National Museum of American History at the remarkable Smithsonian Institution. When the History Channel asked me for a list of my favorite things, I knew it would be impossible to narrow it down. Our collection has 1.8 million objects and over 3 shelf miles of archival collections. But after significant research and some soul searching, I pulled together a list of some of the special objects that have made it into my heart. This 1701 Stradivarius cello, known as the Cervais after the most famous of its 19th century owners, is an incredible instrument with a powerful story, including almost being eaten by wolves during a harrowing sledge ride across the Russian steppes.
used by our amazing chamber music musicians for concerts and recordings. Its tone is often described as absolutely perfect. This cane belonged to Toussaint Louverture, an amazing leader in the Haitian Revolution. This important revolution began as a slave revolt and ended up with the founding of the Free Nation of Haiti in 1804. Nearly 500,000 enslaved people fought for and gained freedom in this revolution. In the United States, the event terrified some and heartened others that were engaged in a fight over slavery's morality and rightful place in the new democratic republic. These tensions led to the Civil War and remain unsolved today. Helen Keller's watch, given to her by her friend, retired diplomat John Hitz, is made to tell time in the dark. Keller engaged in activism for causes she held dear and lived a full life with rich relationships that would change the way people with her level of disability were seen. This is a beautiful redwood surfboard shaped by famed swimmer and surfer Duke Kahanamoku. Duke is known as the father of modern surfing and one of its earliest ambassadors. As a result of his diplomatic efforts, the native Hawaiian indigenous practice and skill of surfing became a global phenomenon. This ball and glove are from the Hia River Camp, one of 10 incarceration or concentration camps that held 120,000 persons of Japanese descent during World War II. Some prisoners formed baseball leagues and took part in the great American pastime of baseball, even as the U.S. government questioned their place in the nation. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Lieutenant Howard Vanderbeek, a U.S. Navy Reserve officer of Dutch descent, was aboard a landing control craft off Utah Beach. When he made it through the battle, he kept the craft's 48-star flag. The symmetrical hole in the lower right corner of the blue field is believed to have come from a German machine gun bullet. Leopoldo Paulin Martinez, a Mexican immigrant to the Los Angeles area and a professional baseball player, clipped newspapers of his career and meticulously pasted them into this magazine. It becomes this fantastic scrapbook that enabled him to insert himself into the larger American narrative by literally inserting himself into a Life magazine. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. asked Althea Thomas to serve as his congregation's organist at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. She modified and wore these tap shoes to glide over the organ's pedals every Sunday during the period when community leaders organized their historic city bus boycott in the church basement. Billie Jean King is a global sports icon and social justice pioneer, particularly since I am a girl from Southern California like she is. She was an incredibly important figure to me. I remember the huge amount of pride we all felt watching her win the Battle of the Sexes tennis match, where she wore this dress. King trounced 55-year-old Bobby Riggs, an outspoken chauvinist, in the match watched by me and 90 million people worldwide. Maya Angelou wrote this declaration for the National Women's Conference in 1977. Its first line reflects how the movement considered history a tool for achieving equality. It says, "We American women view our history with equanimity. We allow the positive achievement to inspire us and the negative omissions to teach us." Matthew Shepard was a gay student who was beaten, tortured, and left to die in Wyoming in 1998. The heinous hate crime fueled the movement for LGBTQ rights. This sweet everyday object is evidence of the boy he was and gives even more power to the symbol of justice that he has become. His loving parents donated this and other objects to us, and we hold them most dear. In 2000, agricultural activists from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers carried this contemporary interpretation of the Statue of Liberty on a 2-week, 230-mile March for Dignity, Dialogue, and a Fair Wage. The statue, created by artist Kat Rodriguez, placed a basket of tomatoes in place of Lady Liberty's typical tablet and gave her a darkened complexion to reflect the racial diversity of the agricultural workers and day laborers that participated in the demonstration. Ed Drew creates tintype photography, a popular portrait medium in the mid to late 19th century, to challenge our preconceived notions of Native Americans and others. This tribal elder is strong and powerful, and the protagonist of his own story. I have long been a fan of Ed's work and was so pleased to find it in the museum's photographic history collections. The iconic red-caped, white-bonneted outfits worn by childbearing servants in Hulu's adaptation of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale have become a powerful symbol. Since the series debuted, handmade costumes have been worn by activists in several high-profile demonstrations, including those for women's reproductive rights. This handmaid's uniform was worn by actress Elizabeth Moss, who plays Offred in the series. These homemade and hand-painted butterfly wings were collected from a young Nebraskan activist who was marching on Capitol Hill in 2018. Monarch wings are an important symbol to undocumented organizers, as their annual journey across the North American continent speaks to the migration, survival, and transformation of many immigrants.
Thanks again to my colleagues, Lauren Safnick, Laura Duff, and our History Channel producer, Allison Gus, for all of the work that went into that video, and all my colleagues who helped at the museum. I'd like to pick up where the video left off with those monarch DACA wings, as they are in our new Girlhood It's Complicated exhibition. Yes, we just opened it in a pandemic. I'm very, very grateful to Doctors Kathleen Franz, Nancy Burka, Maria Losa, Sam Vong, our project manager, Rebecca Klokinda, the remarkable Girlhood team, as well as the American Women's History Initiative of the Smithsonian. DACA, of course, tells many, many stories and is part of an ongoing debate over who gets to be a citizen and who gets to be educated, even in this morning's news. to Chancellor Wilcox's fabulous junior high example. In Girlhood's education section, or Getting Schooled, we also exhibit Minnie Jean Brown's graduation dress of her own design and hand, as well as her expulsion notice from Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Terrorized by white students when she defended herself, she was reprimanded and then expelled. To this day, Black and brown girls are 6 times more likely to face discipline up to expulsion. Minnie Jean has remained an activist her entire life and was integral to the development of this exhibition. Weaving the past with the present, stitching in time, is the work of public historians in particular, as bringing stories to life through material culture stewardship and curation can be a powerful form of education and social justice. This is Betsy Buckland's sampler from 1781. At age 13, she felt free to express her political views. She is making a pitch for the candidacy of George Washington in this sampler. Also told in that section of Girlhood, briefly and expanded like all the sections on the online component of the project, which I encourage you to visit on our website, is the complicated horror of Indian boarding schools, including the story of these children. Around 1880, and with my apologies for any pronunciation errors, Tie usu luktikiwa, trawe isa lunkia, se utitsa, and Jean Itutsia were forcibly taken from their Zuni parents and sent to the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. Everything about their lives changed in an instant, even their names. As an attempt to erase their cultural identity, they were renamed Frank Cushing, Taylor Ely, Mary Ely, and Jenny Hamaker. Frank and Taylor both died while at the school. The good fortune I experienced in understanding and researching such Indian schools long before I arrived at the Smithsonian was largely due to the Sherman Indian Institute being in Riverside, thanks to the work of Cliff Trafser and the force of nature that is Lorraine Sisquak, the director of the Sherman Indian Museum. Through an important partnership, they recently digitized, with the museum and UCR, they recently digitized nearly 13,000 images that are available online through Calisphere. So brava and bravo. Their work demonstrates the critical component of archiving and moreover making accessible through digitization of unique collections such as these that reclaim Indigenous stories, presence, and resilience. As well, they demonstrate the critical importance of partnerships carved from the wood of respect, the steel of determination, and the patina of trust and closeness. Thus, all that weave led to a successful CLEAR grant, one of the most competitive and important archival grant programs in the land. And here are 2 beautiful images from that recently digitized collection. As well, you'll note that I included a modern day tintype by Ed Drew, and here's Ed's self-portrait. I was so fortunate to know and help exhibit Ed's remarkable work along with the other photographs when I was at the California Historical Society with remarkable colleagues like Jessica Howe and Aaron Garcia and Marie Silva and so many others. As Ed explains, producing 5x7 tintypes of Klamath Falls tribes is part of a commission to help redefine the tribal people in the area as no longer victims of the injustices brought upon them by the US government, but as strong and powerful people of today. And here are 2 more of those beautiful tintypes of Spain and her child and Charlene. We were fortunate that at the Historical Society, we presented sensational portrayals of the Modoc War from 1872 to 1873 in parallel with Ed's remarkable tintypes, as we were able to draw on vintage photographs, newspapers, books that sensationalized the war. Including those of Edward Muybridge, who was commissioned by the government to document the war, showing the desolate lava beds and picturing non-Modoc Indians reenacting battle scenes for his camera's lens. So Ed's work, like ours, reaches backwards photographic techniques far older than he to capture the enduring presence of self despite wounds and scars and trauma. Let's go further back in time. I chose Toussaint Louverture's cane in interestingly ways because of my time at UCR, in that wonderful weave of a historian and a humanist's life. I was not assigned to read Michel Roth-Touliau's book ostensibly on the Haitian Revolution, but my dear friend and comrade Rob McCoy was, and he shared that slim volume with me. Importantly, the first manuscript dealing with the revolution of Haiti was penned by none other than Frederick Douglass, the first page of which is here on the right. And I wondered then and I wondered now, why did I learn of this in grad school? Why didn't I understand comparative global revolutions? Why didn't I understand so little on Spain or even on the Mexican Republic? These questions and many others were answered by the very historians who sparked my interest in colonialism, including Gary Nash at UCLA. And then for the reason I'm at UCR, his student and amazing historian, Sharon Salinger. I realize now that historians were baptized in the pond of Edmund Morgan's breakthrough 1975 American Slavery, American Freedom, and the horrifying construction of the type of chattel slavery that became the lasting legacy of the nation's founding, the great American paradox, as Morgan called it, that democracy was founded on the backs of Africans as well as Indian slaves. But why didn't I know more? And it seems clear, and Trulio produces such a powerful assessment, that the Haitian Revolution, knowledge of the Haitian Revolution, disrupts the ethno and Anglo-centric narrative of the nation's founding. So I find myself returning to that slender volume, Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History, that Trulio published first in 1995, for passages like this one. Human beings participate in history both as actors and as narrators. The inherent ambivalence of the word history in many modern languages, including English, suggests this dual participation. In vernacular use, history means both the facts of the matter and a narrative of those facts. Excuse me. Both what happened and that which is said to have happened. The first meaning places an emphasis on the socio-historical process, the second on our knowledge of that process or on a story about that process, end quote. Oh, and that was that's some of the fencing that became an impromptu memorial along Lafayette Square, just north of the White House after George Floyd's death. Thank you. So if we think about our dual roles as active participants in history and telling the stories about history, we can situate ourselves in two important realms of being. And here I'm using another one of the recently digitized images from the Sherman Indian Museum. The first realm is action. And I urge us all to better understand, document, plan with, and preserve the histories of your place, of your nation, of your state, to understand dramatic changes over time. Like so many of us, starting with my early mentors, thinking about the land, the place first, allows us to understand the complex layers and weave of human encounters. And as our Native colleagues have always known, the sacredness of that land. The second is of a storyteller, a narrator. We shape perceptions about the past's value and about the historically and archaeologically important places of the past by the way we tell the stories of place, by how we tell them, who we include, who we exclude, and what we emphasize. My very first day at the National Museum of American History was the 19th of February, 2019, the day of Remembrance. The day when, in 1942, one of my presidential heroes growing up, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, issued Executive Order 9066. Thus, my choosing of the ball and glove from the Here River camp to exemplify those 120,000 Japanese Americans in 10 concentration camps was a key way for me to understand and bring forth an understanding of what Riverside and living in Southern California had taught me. I wouldn't have known as much. I wouldn't have known the significance of my starting on February 19th if it hadn't been, and by the way, nor would many of my colleagues on the East Coast, if it hadn't been for understanding of the importance of the Harada House, the National Historic Landmark in Riverside, California. That work and that interest continued throughout my career and continues to this day. The absolutely critical importance of coming together to find resources to care for the Harada House legacy are critical and ongoing. To share broadly the lessons embodied in the court case, the house, and the collection. I hope most of you know the importance of this house on Lemon Street. But to recap briefly, in 1915, it was the focus of a landmark court case brought by the state of California against the Haradas, against Jukuchi Harada, the father of an immigrant family living in Riverside. Tested the constitutionality of laws preventing immigrants, primarily from Japan, from owning property in California. And after the conclusion of the court case, the Haradas lived in this house until May 23rd, 1942, when they were evacuated and relocated, eventually to 3 different relocation centers. I'll never forget the day I first saw Harold Harada's penciled notation in the upstairs bedroom on the wall before he left for the posting camp in Arizona. Evacuated on May 13th, 1942, Saturday, 7 a.m. Shig, which was short for Shigetsu, his Japanese name. When I was honored to be a professor at La Sierra University and still working after my time at the city of Riverside, still working in the greater Riverside area, Harold was still alive and came out and took students. He would do this for anyone who asked, took students through the Harada House. I'm calling on all of you to help that important Riverside Metropolitan Museum project, and I know many of you are, so thank you. Southern California, my Heimat, features prominently in my life and my lenses as an historian, and of course reflected my choice of objects today from that fabulous Billie Jean King dress, and she is just as fabulous today. She's still an incredible advocate and activist. And Mr. Martinez's scrapbook in the Life magazine. And I'm so looking forward when we can open the Playboy exhibition that was to open last month, but because of the pandemic has not yet opened. In the barrios and the big leagues, en los barrios y las grandes ligas, Dr. Margie Salazar Porzio and so many others have worked incredibly hard on this exhibition that you'll see bridges scholarship, theories, pedagogies with lived histories, with close histories, exhibiting the best of community curation practices and working with communities, not to them, not objectifying them, but with families and with stories and cherishing those and bringing those forth. So what public historians like me and institutions like the National Museum of American History and our sister museums and on the Mall, the California Historical Society, UCR's Public History Program, so many of you strive to do is to help, as the poet Adrienne Rich wrote, reconstitute the world. She's penned, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely and with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. A passion to make and to make again, where such unmaking reigns." Our roles are at once conservative and curatorial in the core definition of those words: to care for, to steward, to preserve, to save, to remember, to stitch forward. Reflecting on the many partnerships and projects, from Juana Briones to Miradas Rebeldes to the Summer of Love, 50th, to Teaching California, all such enriching and important work for which I'm so grateful and always shall be. On poetry, on gender, on equality and equity, let's go to Maya Angelou herself. I chose that incredible 1977 proclamation scroll, and here I'm very grateful to curator Lisa Kathleen Grady and the entire Creating Icons team, one of 3 exhibitions commemorating, problematizing, and expanding understanding of women's role in the United States upon the centennial of the 19th Amendment. Because I didn't know a lot about it, vaguely about it. 2, it was such a remarkable sense of pride and accomplishment. The march started in Seneca Falls, of course, the site of the first Women's Rights Conference in 1848, and went all the way across the country to Houston, where Maya read her poem, signed by all the runners who carried the scroll and the torch along the way. It's 2,000 runners carried that torch, and Maya's poem over 2,600 miles to get to Houston. The federally funded conference was the most purposely diverse and demographically representative group ever assembled in the United States at the time. So I think of it often. And as you know, the Equal Rights Amendment, which was voted upon at that assembly in 1977, has yet to be passed. I often think, yeah, you're right. Go ahead to the next one. Thanks. Sorry, I got a little riff in there. I often think that we shouldn't have to go to a university or to graduate school, as much as I learned, but to understand the richness and the messiness and the depth of the United States past. Context, the importance of where we are, how we are. History teaches us context and maps agency and power, thus giving us the tools to understand our time and our place. So I often want a magic context wand. This one is Gilda's from The Wizard of Oz. Next to, of course, our famous set of Dorothy's ruby slippers. I'd like to show you a new set of ruby slippers that we are so honored to steward as part of the Girlhood exhibition in the next slide. Because girls have not only used fashion, another key section of the Girlhood exhibition, for self-expression, but also to promote social change. And here is Isabella Ayukeli Cornell, a Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma citizen, who used her beautiful prom dress to call attention to the systemic violence and abuse faced by Indigenous women. She chose the color red in solidarity for the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement. Can I have the next slide, please? And here's just a close-up of her dress, which has been, oh, you can go back to her dress, thank you, which has been, along with many of the other costumes and fashion in the exhibition, digitized in 3 dimensions, which is just fascinating. James Baldwin wrote in his address to teachers in 1963 that American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. And I would argue that California's and Riverside's is the same. While I wasn't as brave or fortunate as mi hermana Susan Strait, driving across the country to learn from James Baldwin himself, I carry his words and his challenge with me. He uttered them in the year my parents were married and thus created me, so thus they have also defined my time here on the pale blue dot. So to tell this complex, layered, harsh, wonderful set of stories, especially now during these pandemic times, we have a remarkable variety of historic and cultural resources, those tangible and intangible things that reflect this multiple shared, complicated narrative. historic and prehistoric archaeological sites, Native American village sites, material gathering areas, sacred sites, traditional cultural places and landscapes, agriculture, public, industrial, commercial buildings, adobe houses, stone and barbed wire fences, vineyards and orchards, resort communities, ranches, 20th century buildings, neighborhoods, military installations, communities associated with the railroad, oil, agriculture, rural, farming, ranching landscapes, structures, objects, and districts. To embrace a remarkable and lasting diversity here, to celebrate, to understand the worst horrors of human interaction and the best of our human capacities is what on good days historians get to do. To stand up to large and small injustices with understanding, compassion, and empathy, and to unearth histories in which we can see ourselves reflected, full histories with all participants recognized. This is an image from the, oops, sorry, go back one. Thanks. I think I messed that up. But this is an image from the 1901 time capsule contents of also of the Sherman Indian School recent digitization project. And this is Brockton Avenue for you locals. And that's the Riverside Water Company's main canal and the Riverside Arlington Railway. These are our challenges as historians, and this is my new life. I will always be in a state of becoming a historian, and I know what a head start I had, propped up as I was and I am by the cushions of whiteness and the pillows of the bourgeoisie. Throughout my career, one of my roles, as I now understand it, is to address the often lack of continuity and discourse between academic scholarship and research and public interpretation, commemoration, and not to mention connecting that research and scholarship to activism and advocacy to preserve and to bring forth the very stuff of history, whether it be historic collections or even more challenging, immovable heritage. So I'm going to wrap up with some reflections on your National Museum of American History. That first image that just was on the screen for a bit was from our very first strategic plan in 1953, showing the planned site. Thank you for the brand new museum. You'll see not much else is there at the time. Can I have the next slide, please? When I joined, the strategic plan, as Cliff so kindly mentioned, had lapsed. It ended in 2018. So I challenged my remarkably dedicated staff to help create a new one. So quickly, I'll just run through these slides. Can I have the next slide? Our mission is empowering people, as you can read, to create that more just and compassionate future by doing the work that we do. It's not unlike our last mission, which was also very powerful, but I think takes it and puts it back to audience, back to people, and trying to empower them. And the next slide. This is a big goal in 10 years to become the most successful, inclusive, relevant, and sustainable public history institution in the nation. But with everyone's help, I think we're up for it. And then I have the next slide, please. This brand new strategic plan we adopted earlier this year was tested immediately by the pandemic, tested our new direction and our capacity in so many ways. We're a very place-based, people-oriented, tactile place a museum is. So whether it be at collecting efforts, our digital response, and our scenario planning teams that revved up so incredibly. So when we could return to the museum. We also mounted an outdoor exhibition for the love of freedom. My deep thanks to Dr. Felicia Bell for her help on this. Inspired by Phyllis Wheatley's 1774 poem, "In every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance." When we did open the museum very carefully on the 25th of September, with my thanks to my colleagues, Dr. Benjamin Feiling and others, we asked people to think with us, ask our guests to think with us, what's happened? What do you see differently? What do you want us to see differently through the lens of history? So I will take your leave from Capitol Hill neighborhood in Washington, D.C., from a little 1855 house not too far from this house. My house, like this one, was undoubtedly constructed by enslaved persons. So the richness of our past is testament to the struggles of those who worked and fought to create a better future that presses this nation to live up to its stated ideals. And it's been an honor to be with you just to reveal some of the richness of the histories of places within your region, the vast state of California, and the nation. I'm going to leave you with, I think, some of Lonnie Bunch's words that he published in the 1619 project collaboration with the New York Times that inspire me every day. So thank you so much. Please keep in touch. This is my contact information on the last slide. I look forward to questions with Kathy Gudis, Dr. Kathy Gudis, my friend and inspiration, and to all of you. So thank you again. And I will always be a Highlander.
Thank you so much, Anthea. And I know that if we were in real life, there would be thunderous applause. And so I think we're doing that all virtually as best we can in these times. That was really inspiring. And I have to say that I am especially taken with the ways in which you were able to bring together not only the amazing objects that you selected for your History Channel presentation, but also the stories that weave them together. And then always persistently connecting back to place and community. So I really appreciate that, in particular, as you highlight those places, people, and elements of the living history of our region in the inland region. And so I really, am speaking for everyone when I offer just a note of gratitude. Clyde Derrick wrote that, this is a rich and moving presentation, and it really resonates for the work that we all do, students, staff, and faculty, as well as community members in the region. So thank you so much. I wanted to kick it off before turning to the wonderful questions that people are passing along. I wanted to kind of piggyback on a few of the elements that you were talking about that really span your long history in terms of preserving sites, right? And seeing land as people, that it's not actually separate from us. It is incarnate with that sacred spirit, as you mentioned. But to also think about the really big challenges that you've posed in your strategic plan. And so my question is in part related to some conversations that I've been having about collecting from the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and many of the racial injustices that recent protests have highlighted, to think about the ways in which, when we're documenting and collecting, we're trying to capture a past, right? And we saw the objects that you showed. There's an incredible power to them. The power of stories is sometimes rendered a little less material, but can be hinged to those kinds of objects. Right. What I'm wondering is, how can our National Museum, and this is really coming from some of your own curators, I have to tell you the absolute truth. How can our National Museum mobilize its resources to advance social justice and support community-based memory work and underserved and underrepresented communities? So oftentimes we think about the formation of museums and libraries as a colonial undertaking where the objects were removed from communities and brought to these Capitol buildings. So what do we do today? Do we continue to go along that path, or should we today be leaving collections within their communities? So these are like 2 or 3 loaded up questions all in one.
Just bring them on, babe. Yeah. No, all excellent questions, and thank you, Kathy. It remains an honor to do this work with you and sisterhood. Those are the questions, right? I do think that the ways in which I was so, in hindsight, fortunate to learn and to continue to learn. I think I said that for me, becoming a historian is it's a state of being and a gerund. I was very fortunate to do what people kind of dismissingly called local history first. Thank goodness. I never really thought of it that way. It was more intimate. It was more personal. I think there is a way we have to figure out how to do both. We have to figure out how to honor the stories on the national level while not continuing the often dehumanizing and on a good day patterns of collection from the past. I think you do that by some of the very great work that you guys do in the history department, by honoring story, by collecting oral histories, by digitizing materials and accepting the facsimiles maybe into the digitized facsimiles into the national collection and leaving them locally, or shifting that, right? I mean, the incredible thing about the digital evolution and revolution are the capacities that we haven't had before. That started for me locally with the LA Subject incredible mobile digitization effort of the LA Public Library, which was what, 20 something years ago, right? Right. So, you know, we tend to think of, we tend not to sometimes realize the power of the work we're doing in our own backyards, but you can see the work that LAPL did all the way through the Getty's investment in Pacific Standard Time as a deep understanding of the complexity of especially the greater LA basin. One of the very first things I did at the city of Rancho Cucamonga, because no one told me I shouldn't, was to do an oral history project. And by the time I left 4 years later for the city of Riverside, we split it between viticulture and citriculture. Close to half the people we had interviewed had died. So we were able in 1990, 91, 92 capture individuals who had been active in the 1933 strikes in the fields and in the vineyards. We were able to capture that, but every generation is able to capture that back, if they can, right? Again, that's that kind of stitching in time where you back stitch and then you forward stitch. But it really does, it has, being on the national level, even though I've worked nationally and internationally a little bit, forces you to confront those questions. So I think you do it with a lot of humility and grace, and generosity. If we can help a community understand, document, preserve, share, remember, and conserve their memories, their experiences in a way that is useful and helpful to their lives today and moving forward, I've done my job. I feel good about that. If we create a partnership like Sam Vong did with Isabel's community, and in the end, they, after meetings with aunties and true community sense of giving, decide to give that to the national collection, then that is an honor beyond honor. But that's not a requirement, nor can it be, in my mind, for a whole host of reasons, the community-based ones, as well as the stewardship, the inordinate stewardship responsibilities anyone has who takes on a collection. So, but it is the topic. I could talk about another hour on it, so I probably should move on to the next question, but I'd love to talk to you about it more.
Yeah, and I think that the ideas of community archives are central to the ways in which we're thinking about underrepresented groups. But I know that there are
this building one. We built an archive in Rancho Cucamonga, and everyone's like, "What are you saving?" I'm like, "Oh, there's so much stuff." But see, that's the great thing about working in spaces where people think there isn't any history.
Well, I think we realize that here, right? Like, I think that's.
Yeah, I think you're doing okay.
Yeah. And so, I should say that my name is Kathy Gudis, to those of you out there who are just seeing a picture. And I'm a professor in the history department, and I teach public history along with quite a number of my colleagues in the history department who are working in all different facets of public practice that Anthea mentioned. And so we're really delighted to be able to piggyback on your work, Anthea, in so many ways. There were several questions that came in that I'm going to try and bridge and bring them together, which have to do with politics. So one starting question that that one person with the first name of Steve offered was, how do we keep American history from being politicized? And then another question from another Steve is, how does the Smithsonian respond and or protect itself from people who simply deny reality or historical facts if it doesn't align with their particular political perspectives? And of course, there are examples of this that, range from your girlhood show, It's Complicated, which includes figures, trans figures, Margaret Sanger, another hot button topic there, both for Planned Parenthood and also for ideas of sterilization. So how do you manage this?
Right. So I'm in a Steve sandwich. Yes, I'm in the Steve sandwich every day of my career. Very adroitly and carefully. We are incredibly fortunate to receive about 2/3 of our budget from the federal appropriation, which is critical and is certainly something that we honor and respect. So with that come a whole series of federal rules and regulations that I and every other director and my colleagues and staff take very, very seriously. We can't advocate openly for political partisanship. There's a whole list of things that under the Hatch Act in particular that we need to be very mindful of. And that bleeds over, of course, into our personal lives, especially for activist historians. There is so much bleeding over into that. And as feminist historians shared with us long ago, the personal, is political. So when it came to embracing, remember, Cliff was generous in giving me a lot of way too much credit. I inherited a lot of the exhibitions. Exhibitions have a really long time lead. I inherited these exhibitions. My job, whether it be creating icons, Playboy, a girlhood, my job is to honor the work of my colleagues, to protect it, to understand it, to be able to contextualize it, to defend our choices, and also to understand too that context, remember Gilda's magic context wand, our context has changed. Even in the 3 years or 4 years since we've been 8 years, 10 years, however long certain exhibits have taken to come to fore, the context, especially the political context, has changed around us. And I also try and share that with board members, reporters, and others to help them understand that the ways in which context shapes and moves around us position certain things that we do as historians as inherently political or even partisan. But that's not the intent of them. That's how they go into, their milieu. So we try and just be very, very mindful of that without shying away from the fact that we are bestowed remarkable powers as historians, wherever you work. And I'm also very fortunate that we have the first African-American, first historian, first former museum director as secretary in Dr. Lonnie G. Bunch III. And Lonnie's path-breaking work in creating the National Museum of African-American History and Culture is our guiding light, right? To tell those stories, to bring people into the depths of those difficult stories, to bring them there, to reveal those, to share those, to honor them. And as I like to say, public history isn't brain surgery, but we do like to open minds.
Right. And actually, there were several questions that actually are related to both opening minds and the relationship.
Okay. And brain surgery? No. Okay. No.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was the brain surgeons that are, writing in. Yeah. So, in terms of the different institutions that comprise the Smithsonian, the National Museum of African American History and Culture is a remarkable place and a remarkable addition. And yet the Museum of American History has some overlapping collections. So how is this navigated, and what are the challenges that come with telling the story of peoples who also have their own dedicated institutions or centers? There's also the Latino Center, the Asian Pacific Islander American Center, et cetera.
Right, and the National Museum of the American Indian, the first on the mall. That's an excellent question, and I think the answers would have changed and grown over time. For me, and I'll only speak to my experience here, while understanding what I've inherited in terms of previous relationships that, that Lonnie and others are very honest about, that it had, that because some of that evolution was rocky. I see it as just a remarkable gift that we're all there together. The concentration of devoted, caring, thoughtful, highly intelligent scholars, educators, exhibition designers, program managers, security officers. I mean, this whole incredible community that is the Smithsonian, archivists, collection stewards, collections managers, digital specialists, mean that in the best of us, we work collaboratively. And what I can tell you, all my time in California and in the West has gifted me is that I used to say when I was more in the preservation world that, to paraphrase a famous colonial saying, that united we may stand a chance, but divided we shall surely fall. And then the incredibly brilliant, forthright former state preservation officer of Washington State, Dr. Allison Brooks, leaned across the table from me one day. We were up in Seattle, and she said, Dr. Hartig, get it right. United we may have a chance, and divided we're dead. That's how Allison addressed it. But I think that was probably a little dramatic, but I have so much belief in the hard work, I know as you do too, Kathy, and many on this call do, of cooperation and collaboration. It's not easy, which is why people don't do it all the time. But we're working on a project, if all goes well, with I think 12 different Smithsonian units, division, both museums as well as centers, like you mentioned, that will take one day, December 11th, and do 24 hours in the time of the multiple pandemics, and do this huge online collecting and commemorating and storytelling project. So I'll follow up with you on that. But to me, that's the real power. So that NMAI reaches out to the tribes, we all reach out to our communities, and together we are so much stronger and more varied and more beautiful, right? And longer and larger. So I see that as a huge gift. I also see collaborating on certain projects. So American history, African American history, culture, and the Anacostia Community Museum, which is the Smithsonian's first museum devoted to telling the histories of African Americans, specifically in Washington, but also across the nation. We all worked together very closely this summer in the field in collecting local Black Lives Matter movements, the huge marches, the new Black Lives Matter Plaza, the fence that I showed you briefly around Lafayette Park or Square. And that was hugely important and very collaborative. And we learned a lot together. And imagine we're doing all this as well with PPE on, with trying to figure out, how to even collect during this time. So it takes all of us. It takes the registrars and the collections managers and the curators and our communications experts. And, it kind of takes so many of us to even figure out how to approach it. So I see it as such an incredible gift, and especially leading up to big things. Like we have to figure out all together how we're going to commemorate, problematize, remember, celebrate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 2026. Right. At my very first meeting, I said, how about we just all figure out what we all looked like in 1776, where your place is.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe we start there.
Yeah. And we're not going to get to all the questions, but there are several questions that obviously relate exactly to that especially after, much, damage over the last 4 years to the sense of, unity, how we sort of bridge that in going forward. And I think you've addressed that to a large extent, and you might want to weave that into the next question I want to ask, because I'm cognizant of the time here. And there are really two parts to it, or two questions really, if I'm going to be honest. One is that, and this is from my colleague, Juliet Levy, who does digital humanities.
Sure.
And this also is has come up with.
Does a great job at digital humanities. Yep.
And so we're wondering, we're all excited about all museums opening up again worldwide. But in the meantime, can you speak at all to plans that you may have underway to embed 3D digitizations? You have intervirtual exhibits in augmented reality, or how are you going to bridge just the way we're bridging the hybrid education of being there and not being there? How are you going to do that when museums reopen as well? And I want to leave enough time to ask a really important question for UCR students, but let's throw that one out.
Yes, ma'am. So we're fortunate in that, like many others, including CHS and at UCR in particular, both with special collections and with special projects, like with German Indian Museum, we've all been in the digitization spheres, plural, for quite a while, and we've learned so much as a community. Whether your focus was on digital humanities and using the digitized material, whether it was on digital archiving, whether it was on digital production and program production, right? All of those are coming together. The lines are completely blurred. We are used to, I spend way too many hours a day doing just this, looking at you, knowing you, because I know what I'm blessed to call you my friend, but figuring out ways, right, to bring humanity and learning and care into a screen. So we were fortunate when we launched the COVID-19 Digital Task Force internally to have people who were already working in that space for quite a while, and especially as a national museum using the Smithsonian network of sites and affiliations across the country, and including many in California. We already had tested programs like the National Youth Summit that had worked with high school students all across the land. They'd already done it virtually for a number of years. They'd situated it in our museum, but then they would live cast it out. So sometimes we actually already knew how some of that would work. We immediately flipped a lot of our field work with teachers to weave more into weekly calls, but in English and Spanish with teachers at nighttime, just to say, okay, I'm working on this. Do you have something for this? So we pivoted quite a bit as well. We had already worked on and had launched, I think, a very brave initiative led by Sherry Berger and others in our museum to let go a bit. Letting Go was one of the other critical things we could have talked about, which is a great book written by one of my new colleagues, Benjamin Filey, and others. But we released 1.2 million records in not good shape.
Yeah.
Right? Because we can get very precious, all of us. It's like, well, no, that record's not right yet. That, you fill in the blank isn't good enough yet. Well, if no one even knows we have it, then it's not going to get good enough. So why not let yourself be vulnerable to say, actually, I want to know more about that collection. We're also in spending a lot of time trying to reinterrogate our own collections to a couple of questions ago. Not just community. Decolonization doesn't happen in outside spaces. It happens inside spaces as well, and really re-examining, re-looking at collections. I like to say about digitization that before times, that the digital world and the analog world are our worlds as public historians, right? As people who understand collections in particular, and where they come together, working in the and, right? Where you already have an interest, where you have a need, where you have gaps, the holes in the Swiss cheese of history and of memory that you want to fill, right? Go there. Digitization is a huge and can be very undisciplined. But I think for all of us, really focusing on the power, right, of that and, like, of why we're digitizing and how we're digitizing, and digitizing at scale, right? Digitizing not necessarily at an item level, but more at a group or subject level. Anyways, all kinds of great things to think about. But yes, it needs all of us to think in that space.
Okay, I'm going to ask you for one inspirational thing and it's what advice can you give to, you've given us many inspirational elements, but what advice can you give to our students at UCR who've not always seen themselves represented in museums, of course, in terms of entering the field of public history?
Well, first, I'm doing everything I can, as long as I have on the planet, to make sure that you do see yourself in museums, especially your national museums. One bit of advice. Well, when your friend gives you a book like Michelle Rolfe-Trujillo's book, you take it and you read it. To persevere, nothing we do is easy. My time at UCR was not easy, but it had such moments of incredible connection and joy. And then to believe in your work, to believe in your own story first, and then that your work is of value, and then in as much as you possibly can in all of our strange and hard times that we're facing as a collective, as the collective humanity, to truly relish in the weave of your humanity, right? To make and remake, as Adrienne Rich, so beautifully shared with us. And it can be really hard and strange sometimes. But that's our gift. That's why we get to be historians. So.
Well, thank you for leaving this gift with us too. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Kathy, for moderating.
Thanks.
Excellent. Love your Citrus Park background.
That's right. A little gesture to your past research.
Yeah, absolutely. Part Latimer, part other groves back there. Yeah. Oh, that's great. All right. Well, thank you all so much. And do take the best of care and stay as safe as you can.
And you too.
Eduardo Galeano suggested, history never really says goodbye. History says, see you later. And certainly today's lecture was all about that. A sense that not only do we live history, but we have a responsibility to history to keep its past and its future safe and secure and nurtured in the right ways. But the sense of see you later for me today is not just about history, it's about our good friend, Anthea Hartig. She's a friend and a constant companion here in Riverside, as well as across the whole continent to Washington, D.C. And I know I speak for everybody who was part of this lecture today, saying to Anthea, it's not goodbye, it's see you later. Thanks to everybody for being here, and hope to see all of you later as well. Have a great day.